This lesson is on solving absolute value equations that contain only one absolute value expression. We've already talked about absolute value and how absolute value is the distance from zero on a number line. And if we take the absolute value of a number, like the absolute value of -3, that absolute value is +3 because -3 would be 3 units from 0 on the number line. The same would go for +3. So what we know here when I'm trying to solve an equation where the absolute value of x equals 5 is that if I replaced x with 5 and I took the absolute value, I would get 5. But also if I replaced x with -5, I would get an answer of 5. So here is basically our general rule that if absolute value of a number is equal to a, then u could be, or a could be the positive or the negative value, basically. So we're looking for that positive or the negative value. So when we are solving an equation, then what we're going to do is write the equation the first time. And when I write it, notice I'm writing this without the absolute value brackets, and that's okay. I'm going to write it without the absolute value brackets, and I can only do that because the first time I'm going to write it just as it is, and the second time I'm going to set it equal to the negative value. So here I'm going to add my 15 to each side, and I get c equals 38. And on this side I'm going to add 15 to each side, and I get c equals -8. Now what that means is I could plug 38 back into this equation. 38 minus 15 is 23. The absolute value of that is 23. If I plug in -8, -8 minus 15 is -23, but then the absolute value sign makes it +23. So that's what we're working with, is setting it first equal to the positive value and then equal to the negative value. So now we're just going to do some practice. And what I can tell you is before you're able to write the equation 2 times, you need to make sure that the absolute value is by itself. So here, before I write it twice, I'm going to add 8 to each side of the equal sign. And that's going to give me the absolute value of 5 minus x is equal to 9. And now I can write it 2 times. So I'm going to write 5 minus x equals 9. And 5 minus x equals -9. So I had to do this step first before I was able to break it down into 2. So I'm going to subtract 5 from each side and get -x equals 4, divide by -1 on each side to get x equals -4. Same on this one. When I subtract 5, I get -x equals -14. And when I divide by -1, I get x equals 14. So either of those values, when I plug them in, should work to make the whole expression equal to 1. For my second one, again, I'm going to have to get rid of this +8. So I'm going to subtract 8 from each side, and that gives me the absolute value of 5 minus x is equal to -7. So I'm going to stop right here because I can't have an absolute value equal a -7 because we all know that once it's inside the bracket, the absolute value is going to make it positive. So I can't have a value turn into a negative after it comes out of the absolute value. So this is going to be a no solution because there's no number that I can plug in there that when I take the absolute value, I'm going to get -7 as my answer. Here are a few more for us to try together. This one, I already have that absolute value bracket separated. So I'm going to call this 4x plus 1 equals 9 and 4x plus 1 equals -9. I'm going to subtract 1 from each side and divide by 4. And that gives me x equals 2. And on my second one, I'm following the exact same steps. I get 4x equals -10. I divide by 4. I get x equals, I'm just going to reduce that fraction to -5/2. For my second one, again, you have to get the absolute value bracket alone before you can write it twice. So that gives me 3z plus 10 in the absolute value is equal to -2. And just like that last example, I can't have an absolute value equal to a negative, so this is a no solution. Try these two on your own, then press play to see how you did. For my first one, I have the absolute value all by itself, so I am going to write it twice. 2w minus 3 equals 5, and 2w minus 3 equals negative 5. I'm going to add 3 to each side, which gives me 2w equals 8. Divide by 2 to give me w equals 4. And on my second example, I'm going to do it the exact same way. 2w equals negative 2. Divide by 2, I get w equals negative 1. Keep in mind that quite often in our online learning platform, you're going to end up writing your answer in the set brackets, which I didn't do on our last examples, but that's the proper way to write your two solutions. For my second equation, when I subtract 6, it becomes clear pretty quickly that I'm going to have an absolute value equal to a negative, so this is going to be a no solution. Remember, another way to write no solution is the empty set. Our next example is very similar to the last, but now it's just a little bit more complicated. Again, we're trying to get the absolute value alone. So I'm going to start just like I would if this were an x, negative 2x minus 7 equals 19. I would start furthest away, which means I would add that 7 to each side, which gives me negative 2 times all of this equals negative 12. And then again, I'm not concerned yet that it's a negative because I still have to divide this by negative 2 on each side, which gives me the absolute value of 2/5 p plus 3 equals positive 6. So once I've gotten it to this point and I see that it's positive, now I can write it 2 times and solve. So the first time, 2/5 p plus 3 equals 6, and 2/5 p plus 3 equals negative 6. So those are my two equations. I'm going to solve by subtracting 3. That gives me 2/5 p equals 3. I'm going to choose to multiply by the reciprocal on this question. So I'm going to multiply each side by 5/2. Notice I've just changed that 3 into 3/1 to make it easier to multiply. On this side, everything cancels and I just get p, and on this side I get 15/2. And on my other example, again, I'm going to subtract 3. That gives me 2/5 p equals negative 9. And then again, I'm going to multiply by the reciprocal, which is 5/2. So I turn that negative 9 into negative 9/1, and then times 5/2. I get p equals negative 45/2, and it's just fine to leave your answers in that format. So my two answers would be 15/2 and negative 45/2. Try this one on your own. For this one, my absolute value is on the opposite side, and that's okay, but I still have this plus 6.9, so I'm going to subtract 6.9 from each side. 6.9 minus 6.9 cancels out. I get 0 equals 4.1 minus p. And a lot of people get confused with this one because I can't really write it 2 times, but what I can do is I can solve it just like this. So notice I've just dropped the absolute value sign. I don't get to write it twice because there is no such thing as negative 0. But in order to solve, probably the easiest way would be to add p to each side instead of dealing with a 4.1. 0 plus p is p. On this side, it's 4.1. Oops. So 4.1, if I plug it back in, 4.1 minus 4.1 would be 0. Plus 6.9 equals 6.9, and so that checks out.